Okay, so get this. What if I told you that like a book written way back in 1817 is still affecting Indian American children today?
Wow.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, that is pretty wild.
But that's what we're going to be looking at today in this deep dive.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, we're taking a look at colonial discourse and the suffering of Indian American children.
Okay.
To understand how history can have these like really long-lasting impacts.
That's what's so fascinating about this, right? We're not just talking about some dusty old book. Like, we're talking about how ideas have trickled down through the years and, even show up in modern textbooks.
Right, and that's where it gets really concerning, right?
Yeah.
Because those textbooks are shaping how young people understand their own heritage. And this deep dive is especially relevant for you if you're interested in book reviews, history, or cultural representation.
Absolutely.
So if that sounds like you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Book Reviews 1,
Yes.
and share this episode with your friends.
Spread the word. So the book we're looking at today is written by Kundan Singh and Krishna Maheshwari.
Okay.
And they trace this whole thing back to a British East India Company official named James Mill.
Okay.
Mill wrote The History of British India, and his views on Hindus were, let's just say, less than flattering.
To put it mildly.
To put it mildly, yeah.
He basically painted them as backwards and stuck in the past.
Yeah.
For example, he claimed that because India had abundant resources, Hindus remained nomadic for a long time, which he saw as a sign they hadn't progressed.
Right. His argument was that because they didn't have to, settle down, quote unquote, and work hard for resources,
Right.
they never developed the same drive for civilization as, say, Europeans.
It's like he was saying they had it too easy.
Exactly.
And he also went after the Hindu caste system,
Of course.
portraying it as a rigid hierarchy where the Brahmins were at the top,
Yeah.
controlling everyone through religion.
Right, and he didn't stop there.
Oh, no.
Mill labeled Hindu laws and governance as arbitrary and despotic, and he called their religious beliefs primitive, pagan, and fueled by fear and greed.
So basically, he used his book to push the narrative that Hindus needed British rule to become civilized.
In a way, yes. His book was basically colonial propaganda disguised as history.
Right. And what's shocking is that these biased ideas, though often presented in a more subtle way, still show up in some modern textbooks.
It's really concerning, isn't it?
It's like these outdated ideas are having this ripple effect across generations.
Exactly. To understand this ripple effect, the authors bring in the work of some brilliant thinkers like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi.
Okay.
These are heavy hitters in post-colonial thought.
Yeah.
And they offer crucial insights into how colonialism continues to impact people even after, political freedom has been achieved.
I have to admit, that post-colonial thought sounds a little intimidating.
Sure.
Can you break it down for us a little?
Yeah, think of it as a way of understanding how colonialism continues to shape our world today. For example, Memmi talks about the colonizer-colonized dialectic, which essentially means that the colonizer defines themselves as superior by portraying the colonized as inferior.
Okay.
It's about creating this power dynamic where one group is always on top.
So it's like a psychological game where one side needs the other to be less than in order to feel powerful.
Exactly. And Césaire takes it further, arguing that racism is at the heart of colonialism.
Wow.
It's used to justify the domination of one group over another and devalue their culture.
And what about Fanon? What's his take on all of this?
Fanon focuses on the psychological impact of this colonial mindset.
Okay.
He talks about how internalizing negative stereotypes can lead to feelings of inferiority, confusion about one's identity, and even self-hatred among the colonized.
Wow, self-hatred, that's intense.
Yeah.
It's like colonialism can damage people's sense of self-worth on such a deep level.
That's precisely what Fanon was highlighting, and the authors of our featured book, they connect this to how Mill's negative portrayal of Hindus is impacting Indian American kids today.
Okay, so we've got this historical context, we've got these powerful theories, but how does it all connect to what's happening in schools today?
Right. That's where the book really gets into the nitty-gritty.
Right.
They analyze actual textbook excerpts to show how Mill's views, though not explicitly stated, are subtly echoed in how topics like the Aryan invasion migration theory and the Hindu caste system are presented.
So it's like these biases are hidden in plain sight.
That's one way to put it.
Wow.
It's subtle, but it's there.
Okay.
For instance, instead of talking about Aryan invaders, you might see textbooks emphasizing the migration of people speaking Indic languages from Central Asia, which implicitly supports the idea that Indian civilization was heavily influenced by outsiders.
Oh, that is subtle.
Right.
But the message is still the same.
Yeah.
It's like They're trying to be politically correct while still pushing the same old colonial narrative.
Exactly. And it's not just the Aryan invasion migration theory. When textbooks discuss the caste system, they often focus on its negative aspects, hierarchy and oppression, which reinforces the image of Hindu society as inherently flawed.
Right. It's like they're presenting a very one-sided view, which doesn't really capture the complexity of Hindu society, both past and present.
Right. And it's this one-sided view that can have a profound impact on young minds.
Yeah.
The authors argue that this is a major source of the suffering Indian American children experience because of their heritage.
So let's talk about that suffering.
Sure.
How are kids being affected by these subtle biases in textbooks?
Yeah, the book doesn't just make theoretical claims. They share powerful personal stories from Indian American students who have experienced everything from bullying to deep feelings of shame because of what they've learned about their heritage in school.
That's heartbreaking.
It is.
And it highlights the real-world consequences of these seemingly abstract ideas.
Exactly. It's a reminder that words have power. And the way we choose to frame information can have a lasting impact on how people understand themselves and their place in the world.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've laid out the problem, this subtle but pervasive influence of colonial thought on how Hinduism is taught in schools.
Right.
But what can be done about it? The authors don't just leave us with this sense of despair, do they?
No, not at all.
Okay.
The book explores some ways to challenge these outdated narratives and create a more nuanced and accurate understanding of different cultures, which is what we'll dig into next.
And remember, if you're enjoying this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button.
Yeah.
Subscribe to Book Reviews 1.
Do it.
And leave a comment below.
We'd love to hear from you.
We'll be right back with more on colonial discourse and the suffering of Indian American children. Stay tuned.
Stay with us. Welcome back to our deep dive into colonial discourse and the suffering of Indian American children.
Yes.
We've been discussing how James Mill's biased views on Hindus, written back in the 1800s, have had a surprisingly long-lasting impact, even showing up in modern textbooks.
It's really concerning to think that these outdated ideas are still circulating.
Yeah.
And potentially affecting how kids see themselves and their heritage.
Absolutely. And the authors of the book, Kundan Singh and Krishna Maheshwari,
Right.
they don't just talk about this in general terms, though. They actually analyze specific examples from textbooks
Okay.
to illustrate how this subtle bias plays out.
So what kind of things are we talking about here?
Right.
What does this bias look like in practice?
Well, one of the key areas they focus on is the way textbooks present the Aryan invasion migration theory.
Okay.
You might recall that we talked about how some textbooks use phrases like people speaking Indic languages instead of explicitly mentioning Aryan invaders.
Right. Like they're trying to soften the language, but still pushing the same idea that Indian civilization was heavily influenced by outsiders.
Exactly. And what the authors point out is that this narrative ignores a growing body of evidence that challenges the traditional Aryan invasion migration theory. There's increasing research suggesting that the origins of Indian civilization are far more complex than this simple invasion or migration model suggests.
So it's like these textbooks are clinging to an outdated theory that fits neatly into a colonial worldview, even when the evidence points in a different direction.
That's one way to put it. And it's not just about the Aryan invasion migration theory.
Right.
The authors also analyze how textbooks portray the Hindu caste system.
I'm guessing it's not a very positive portrayal.
Unfortunately not. The focus tends to be on hierarchy and oppression, painting a very one-dimensional and negative picture of Hindu society.
Which, if you think about it, echoes James Mill's portrayal of Hindus as backward and in need of European civilization.
Right.
It's like history repeating itself.
That's a good observation. And what's even more concerning is that these textbooks often conflate ancient Hindu practices with modern Indian society.
Oh, okay.
They create this impression that Hinduism is frozen in time, and that Hindus today are still bound by these ancient and oppressive systems.
So it's like they're perpetuating stereotypes and ignoring the diversity and evolution of Hindu beliefs and practices over time.
Exactly. And it's this kind of skewed portrayal that can have a real impact on Indian American children.
Okay, let's talk about that impact.
Okay.
We know that these biases can lead to things like bullying and feelings of shame, but the book also explores the deeper psychological effects, right?
That's right. The authors draw on the work of Frantz Fanon, who we mentioned earlier, to explain how internalizing negative stereotypes can actually lead to feelings of self-hatred.
Self-hatred is such a strong word. It's hard to even imagine feeling that way about your own heritage.
It is, but Fanon's work helps us understand how these internalized messages, especially when they're coming from sources of authority, like textbooks, can be incredibly damaging to a person's sense of self.
It's like you're being taught to see your own culture as inherently flawed or inferior, which can make it really difficult to feel proud of who you are.
That's exactly what Fanon was highlighting, and the authors of this book make a compelling case that this is happening to some Indian American children.
Wow.
They're being bombarded with these negative messages,
Right.
both explicitly and subtly, and it's taking a toll on their self-esteem and their sense of belonging.
It's a reminder that education isn't just about filling kids' heads with facts.
Yeah.
It's about shaping their identities and worldviews.
Absolutely. And when those identities and worldviews are being shaped by colonial biases, it's a serious problem.
So we've talked about the theory, we've analyzed the textbooks.
Right.
But the book also includes something that makes this whole issue feel much more real and urgent.
Right.
The personal stories of Indian American students.
You're right. The authors weave in powerful testimonies from students who've experienced firsthand the negative consequences of these biased narratives. It's one thing to talk about it in abstract terms, but it's another to hear about the real-life impact on kids.
So what are some of the things these students are saying?
Their stories range from experiencing overt bullying and discrimination to grappling with feelings of shame and confusion about their heritage.
Okay.
One particularly poignant testimony comes from a fifth grader who is terrified of facing the same bullying that his older Indian American friends have experienced.
I can't even imagine how stressful and isolating that must feel.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
Yeah.
He talks about how his friends have been mocked for their religious practices, how their traditional dances have been ridiculed, and he's terrified that he'll be the next target.
It really highlights how these biases can create a climate of intolerance that affects everyone, even kids who haven't been directly targeted.
Exactly. It's like this toxic cloud that hangs over them.
Yeah.
Another student, a seventh grader, talks about feeling ashamed of her heritage.
Wow.
After her classmates learned about Hinduism in a way that focused heavily on caste and oppression.
So she's being forced to confront these negative stereotypes and defend her culture at an age where she's still trying to figure out who she is.
It puts her in this incredibly unfair position.
Right.
These testimonies really bring home the point that these textbook biases aren't just abstract ideas.
Right.
They have a real and tangible impact on young lives.
It makes you realize that we need to be much more careful about the information we're presenting to young people.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to something as sensitive as cultural and religious identity.
I completely agree. We can't just assume that textbooks are neutral and objective.
Right.
We need to be aware of the potential biases they contain and how those biases can harm students.
Okay, so we've seen the evidence, we've heard the testimonies.
Right.
The impact of these colonial narratives on Indian American children is undeniable.
Yeah.
But what can we do about it? The book doesn't just leave us with a sense of despair, does it?
Not at all.
Okay.
The authors offer some thought-provoking solutions and paths forward.
Okay.
They emphasize, for example, the importance of moving beyond simplistic binary thinking.
So instead of seeing the world in black and white, good versus bad, civilized versus uncivilized, we need to embrace complexity and nuance, especially when it comes to understanding different cultures.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there are multiple perspectives, multiple ways of understanding the world, and that no single culture has a monopoly on truth or righteousness.
That makes a lot of sense. And what else do they suggest?
They also highlight the importance of amplifying the voices of those who have been marginalized and misrepresented.
Okay.
It's about seeking out sources of information that offer a different perspective than the dominant narrative. And it's about listening to the stories of those who've been impacted by these harmful narratives.
So instead of just relying on textbooks that were written from a particular, often biased perspective, we need to actively seek out alternative sources of information, especially those that come directly from the communities that have been misrepresented.
You've got it.
Okay.
It's about diversifying the voices we're exposed to and recognizing that there's no one right way to tell history or to understand culture.
This is a great starting point,
Yeah,
but I imagine there's a lot more to unpack when it comes to solutions.
absolutely. We'll delve deeper into these strategies and explore other potential paths forward in the final part of our deep dive.
Get it.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
We're back.
We've been deep diving into colonial discourse and the suffering of Indian American children.
Right.
And it's been a pretty eye-opening journey.
It has.
We've seen how historical biases about Hinduism can show up in unexpected places like modern textbooks.
Yeah.
And the real harm that this can cause.
It's definitely been a thought-provoking discussion, but as we wrap things up, it's important to remember that we don't just want to leave you with a sense of despair.
Right.
We want to empower you with knowledge and ideas for action.
Exactly. So where do we go from here? How do we actually start dismantling these harmful narratives and creating a more accurate and inclusive understanding of different cultures?
One of the key things that the authors emphasize is the importance of critical thinking and media literacy.
Okay.
It's not enough to just passively absorb information. We need to be active and engaged learners.
So it's about questioning the information we encounter, considering the source, and being aware of potential biases, especially when it comes to representations of culture and history.
Precisely. And this is a skill we need to start teaching young people early on.
Yeah.
We need to equip them with the tools to navigate a world that's flooded with information, some of which is intentionally misleading or biased.
It's like giving them a mental filter to help them sift through all the noise and identify what's credible and what's not.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of filtering information, another crucial step is being more mindful about the sources we turn to for knowledge.
So what are some good strategies for finding more accurate and nuanced perspectives, especially when it comes to learning about different cultures?
Well, as we touched on earlier, diversifying our sources is crucial. Instead of relying solely on mainstream textbooks or media outlets, seek out perspectives from within the communities being represented.
So if we're specifically talking about learning about Hinduism, we should look for books, articles, documentaries, maybe even podcasts created by Hindu scholars, writers, and artists.
Exactly. Look for voices from the diaspora, voices that challenge the dominant narratives and offer fresh insights. There's a wealth of knowledge out there waiting to be discovered.
And it's not just about reading or watching, right? We can also learn directly from people.
Absolutely. Don't underestimate the power of personal storytelling.
Okay.
Talk to your Indian American friends, neighbors, and colleagues about their experiences. Ask them about their perspectives on how Hinduism has been portrayed and how it shaped their lives.
It's about moving beyond books and articles and engaging in real conversations with people who can offer firsthand insights.
That's where true understanding and empathy begin. And as we learn and grow, it's important to advocate for change within our educational systems.
So this is where we go from personal learning to actually making a difference in the wider world.
Right.
What are some concrete actions we can take?
We can start by challenging biased textbook content.
Okay.
And pushing for more inclusive and accurate curricula. We can demand more representation of marginalized perspectives in our schools.
And we can support teachers who are committed to creating inclusive classrooms where all students feel seen, heard, and respected.
Right. And let's not forget about the powerful influence of the arts and media.
Right.
We need to support films, TV shows, music, and art that offer nuanced and authentic portrayals of Indian culture and Hinduism.
Because representation matters.
It does?
It shapes how we see ourselves and each other.
Exactly. It's about dismantling those harmful stereotypes and replacing them with images and stories that reflect the richness and diversity of human experience.
It's about creating a world where all children, regardless of their background, feel empowered to embrace their heritage and their identity.
That's a vision worth striving for, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And that's what makes books like Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children so important.
Yeah.
They shine a light on uncomfortable truths and inspire us to work towards a more just and equitable world.
It's been a privilege to explore these ideas with you.
Likewise.
And if you're watching this on our Book Reviews 1 channel, we encourage you to check out the book for yourselves.
Please do.
There's so much more to uncover.
And don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this episode with your friends.
We'd appreciate that.
Let's keep this conversation going. We believe that by working together, we can create a world where every child feels empowered to embrace their heritage and their identity.
That's our hope.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.